Imagine an aircraft so fast that it could take off from New York, and before you even finished your morning coffee, it would already be approaching Moscow. Not a missile, it's not a rocket, an actual piloted aircraft. It's carrying enough nuclear weapons to level an entire nation. This wasn't science fiction. This was the XB-70 Valkyrie, and I genuinely believe it represents one of the most ambitious and terrifying engineering achievements in human history. Now here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. The United States spent billions of dollars developing this incredible machine. They pushed the boundaries of aerospace engineering further than anyone thought possible. They created technologies that seemed like they belonged in the next century. And in response, the Soviet Union didn't just build one aircraft to counter it. They built an entire fighter fleet. They developed new missile systems. They completely restructured their entire air defense network, all because of this single American bomber. It could outrun almost anything in the sky. But here's the mind-blowing twist. By the time the Soviets had finished building their response, the Americans had already canceled the XB-70 program. The fighter jets designed specifically to shoot it down would never face their intended target. It's one of the most expensive games of chess ever played, where both sides made massive moves, and then the board was simply put away. If you find Cold War aviation as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and give this video a like. I spend countless hours researching these hidden stories, and your support helps me bring more of them to you. So let me take you back to the late 1950s. The Cold War was at its most intense. Both superpowers were locked in a race that went far beyond just nuclear weapons. They were competing in technology, in ideology. In every measurable way possible in the realm of strategic aviation, the Americans had identified a critical vulnerability. You see, the existing fleet of B-52 Stratofortresses, while capable and reliable, flew at subsonic speeds and relatively modest altitudes. Soviet air defenses were improving rapidly. Surface-to-air missiles were becoming more accurate. Fighter interceptors were getting faster. American military planners looked at the trajectory of Soviet defensive capabilities and saw a troubling future. Within a decade, they calculated, the B-52 would become increasingly vulnerable. The solution? Speed and altitude. If you could build a bomber that flew so high and so fast that no existing weapon system could catch it, you would have an untouchable nuclear delivery platform. This wasn't just military theory. This was existential strategy. The ability to guarantee nuclear retaliation was the foundation of deterrence. And deterrence was the only thing preventing global annihilation. Now, I want you to truly understand the technical challenge here, because I think it's genuinely underappreciated. In 1955, when the Air Force issued the requirement for what would become the XB-70, they were asking for an aircraft that could cruise at Mach 3. That's 3 times the speed of sound. Over 2,000 miles per hour at that speed. Air friction heats the aircraft's skin to temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit. No aluminum airframe could survive that. No existing engines could sustain that speed. No known materials could handle that heat for hours at a time. They were essentially asking industry to invent an entirely new category of aircraft, using materials and technologies that didn't even exist yet. And somehow, North American Aviation said yes. The engineering team that assembled included some of the most brilliant minds in aerospace history. They faced problems that had never been solved before. How do you build an airframe that can withstand 600-degree temperatures 4 hours? You use stainless steel honeycomb construction and titanium. But working with these materials at this scale had never been done. They had to invent new welding techniques, new fabrication methods, new everything. How do you create engines powerful enough to push a 400,000-pound aircraft to Mach 3? You develop the General Electric YJ-93, each producing 30,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner. 6 of these monsters would power the Valkyrie. But these engines didn't exist when the program started. They had to be created from scratch. How do you maintain stable flight at 3 times the speed of sound? At these velocities, traditional aerodynamic principles behave differently. The XB-70 designers came up with a revolutionary solution that I still find absolutely brilliant. They designed the wingtips to fold downward during supersonic flight, up to 65 degrees. This wasn't just for stability. It actually captured the shockwave produced by the aircraft's nose and used it to generate additional lift.
They called it compression lift, and it was a concept that had never been implemented in a production aircraft. The delta wing configuration spanned 105 feet. The fuselage stretched 185 feet, longer than a Boeing 737. The vertical stabilizers rose to a height of 30 feet. When you look at photographs of the XB-70, what strikes me most is how alien it looks. Even by today's standards, it seems like something that should exist in the future, not something that flew in 1964. The fuel system alone was a marvel of engineering. The XB-70 carried over 40,000 gallons of JP6 fuel, a special high flashpoint jet fuel developed specifically for high-temperature applications. At Mach 3, the fuel served a dual purpose. Beyond powering the engines, it acted as a heat sink, absorbing thermal energy from the airframe before being burned. This thermodynamic balancing act required precise engineering of the fuel flow systems. The cockpit design is particularly interesting. The two crew members sat in escape capsules rather than traditional ejection seats. At Mach 3, conventional ejection would have been fatal. The air density at that speed would have killed any pilot instantly. So the engineers designed capsules that would close around the crew members, protecting them from the blast of hypersonic air. These capsules could be ejected and would descend by parachute, theoretically allowing survival even at maximum speed. It was an acknowledgement of just how far beyond normal aviation parameters this aircraft operated. The navigation and bombing systems were equally advanced. The XB-70 used an inertial navigation system combined with a sophisticated radar system that could map terrain and identify targets. Remember, this was decades before GPS. The aircraft had to be capable of flying thousands of miles, finding a specific target, and delivering its weapons with precision. The computational systems required to accomplish this were cutting edge for their era. Speaking of weapons, let me tell you what the XB-70 was designed to carry. The internal weapons bays could accommodate up to 14 nuclear bombs. The primary weapon would have been the B-41 thermonuclear bomb, the most powerful weapon ever deployed by the United States. A single B-41 had a yield of approximately 25 megatons. To put that in perspective, that's over 1,600 times the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. A single XB-70 could have carried more destructive power than all the explosives used in World War II combined. This brings me to something I think is worth contemplating. When we talk about these aircraft as engineering achievements, it's easy to lose sight of their purpose. The XB-70 was designed to end civilization. Its mission profile assumed the destruction of entire cities, the deaths of millions, the initiation of a nuclear exchange that could have exterminated humanity. The brilliant engineers who created this magnificent machine were building the ultimate instrument of mass death. I don't say this to condemn them. They were working within the context of their time, trying to protect their country from what they saw as an existential threat. But I think it's important to hold both truths simultaneously. The XB-70 was a remarkable achievement and a terrible weapon. Its beauty doesn't diminish its horror, and its horror doesn't diminish its beauty. Now, I need to explain something about the strategic thinking of this era, because it's crucial to understanding why the XB-70 seemed so necessary. In the late 50s and early 60s, intercontinental ballistic missiles were still in their infancy. They existed, yes, but their accuracy was questionable, their reliability uncertain, and their numbers limited. Manned bombers were still considered the primary nuclear delivery system. A manned bomber could be recalled, a missile, once launched, could not. And if you're going to rely on manned bombers, you need bombers that can survive to reach their targets. The XB-70 would fly at 70,000 feet, far above the practical ceiling of any 1950s fighter jet. It would cruise at Mach 3, faster than any operational interceptor. It would carry nuclear weapons capable of destroying any target on Earth, and it would be essentially invulnerable to anything the Soviets could throw at it. At least, that was the theory. What I find remarkable about the Soviet response is how seriously they took the threat. Remember, the XB-70 was still on the drawing board when Soviet intelligence first learned of its existence. The aircraft wouldn't fly for years, but the implications of an American Mach 3 bomber were so alarming that the Soviet military began developing countermeasures immediately. The challenge facing Soviet engineers was unprecedented. How do you intercept an aircraft flying at 70,000 feet at 3 times the speed of sound? Yet the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau accepted the challenge. What emerged would become one of the most legendary aircraft of the Cold War era, the MiG-25 Foxbat. Here was an aircraft designed with a singular purpose: to kill a specific enemy aircraft that didn't even exist yet. Every design decision was made with the XB-70 in mind. The development timeline is remarkable. The Soviet government issued the requirement in 1961, the same year the Americans cancelled the XB-70 as a weapon system, but the Soviets didn't know about the cancellation.
The MiG-25 had enormous wings for its weight, giving it excellent high-altitude performance. Its twin engines were positioned close together, giving the aircraft its distinctive look. The large rectangular air intakes could swallow enormous quantities of air. The Soviets built the MiG-25 primarily from nickel-steel alloys. This made the aircraft heavier. But Soviet engines were powerful, and weight could be compensated with thrust. The resulting aircraft was a brute, a machine of raw power rather than elegant efficiency. It could reach speeds of Mach 2.83 in operational configuration. And in test flights without weapons, it reportedly exceeded Mach 3. Its service ceiling was over 67,000 feet, with some sources claiming 80,000 feet in zoom climbs for its intended purpose, killing the XB-70. It would have been devastatingly effective. But here's what makes this story even more interesting. The Soviets didn't stop with just the MiG-25. They simultaneously developed an entirely new generation of surface-to-air missiles. The S-200, capable of engaging targets at altitudes exceeding 100,000 feet and speeds beyond Mach 5. The entire Soviet air defense network was restructured around the threat of high speed. High-altitude penetrators, billions of rubles were spent preparing to counter an aircraft that in some ways represented America's ultimate conventional weapon. And here's the crucial irony I keep coming back to. The XB-70 was canceled in 1961 as a weapon system. Before the first prototype even flew, the reasons had nothing to do with Soviet countermeasures. American strategic thinking had simply evolved. By the early 60s, ICBMs had matured. Nuclear submarines with Polaris missiles provided an invulnerable second strike capability. The need for a manned supersonic bomber seemed less urgent.
President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, was particularly skeptical. He announced that the XB-70 would continue only as a research program, not as a weapon system. The Air Force's dream of a Mach 3 bomber fleet was over before it began, but the prototypes were already under construction, and they would eventually fly. The first XB-70 took to the skies on September 21, 1964, from Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Test pilots reported that the Valkyrie handled beautifully. It achieved Mach 3 cruise sustained for extended periods. It demonstrated that an aircraft of this size and speed was not only possible, but practical. Then tragedy struck. On June 8, 1966, during a simple photo opportunity flight, the second XB-70 was struck by an F-104 starfighter. The collision destroyed both vertical stabilizers. The massive bomber entered an uncontrollable flat spin. The co-pilot, Carl Cross, was unable to eject and died in the crash. Pilot Al White managed to escape but was severely injured. NASA pilot Joe Walker was killed instantly. The loss of XB-70 No. 2 effectively ended the flight test program. The remaining aircraft continued flying until February 1969, when it was retired to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, where it remains today. If you ever get the chance to see it in person, I highly recommend it. Stand beneath this aircraft, and you will feel its impossible scale and absolute ambition. The technology developed for the XB-70 didn't disappear. Compression lift, high-temperature alloys, sustained Mach 3 data. All of it influenced the supersonic transport programs, the space shuttle, and even modern hypersonic research. On the Soviet side, the MiG-25, built to kill a ghost, became a legend in its own right, flying reconnaissance missions that no one could stop. Both superpowers invested enormous resources responding to perceived threats. Both created genuine engineering masterpieces, and both were in some ways obsolete before they were completed. That is the paradox of the arms race. When I look at the Valkyrie today, I see human ambition at its most audacious. People who looked at the laws of physics and said, "We can work with that." Yes, it was a weapon of mass destruction, but it was also a testament to what humans can achieve when they commit themselves to a goal. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Drop a like if this story blew your mind. Tell me in the comments, should America have built a fleet of XB-70s, or was cancellation the right decision? And if you want more forgotten aviation stories from the Cold War and WW2, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next time we'll dive into another insane aircraft that changed everything. Until then, keep watching the skies. This was the story of the XB-70 Valkyrie, the Mach 3 monster that almost ended the world, but instead became a legend.